promise we'll get you on your feet later to sing some songs, but you can sit and sing this one with us. I'm sure you'll know it, and you'll start to get the theme of today. So, Stephen, take it away.
Okay, Adam.
Thank you.
On the road must have a code that you can live by, and so become yourself, because the past is just a goodbye. Teach your children well, the Father's help, it slowly go by. On your dreams, the one they pick, the one you'll know by. Don't you ever ask them why, if they told you you would cry. So just look at them and sigh, and know they love you.
Y'all sound great.
Of the tender you can know the fear you see. We must be free to teach our children with your believe. They seek the truth over before they can live and teach the children's well. The children's hell will slowly go by. On your dreams, the one they pick, the one you'll know by. Don't you ever ask them why, if they told you you would cry. So just look at them and sigh, and know they love you.
Great job, everybody. Well, it's about time to introduce our host for today's festivities. Please give a warm welcome to Miss Melissa Cook.
Welcome thing there. That's neat. All right, welcome to Sunday Assembly. My name's Melissa. I'm your host today. Exits are to the right and left. Anything should happen, just follow me. I'll be the first one running out. To your right are the bathrooms. Use whichever ones you feel you need to use. There's coffee, tea, and water out there if you're thirsty. We do have kids' activities upstairs. If anybody wants to make Play-Doh brains. Sorry, I don't need everybody leaving at once to do that. Sorry. So what are we? Sunday Assembly is a secular congregation that celebrates life. Our motto, live better, help often, and wonder more. Our mission to help everyone find and fulfill their full potential. Our vision, a secular congregation in every town, city, and village that wants one. It is 100% a celebration of life. We are born from nothing, we go back to nothing. Always live on the bright side of life. There's never a time I'm up here that I will not do that to. Okay. We have no doctrine. We have no set text, so we can make use of wisdom from all sources. We have no deity, but we don't do the supernatural, but we won't tell you you're wrong if you do. It is radically inclusive. Everyone is welcome, regardless of their beliefs. This is a place of love that is open and accepting. We are free to attend. We're not for profit and volunteer run. We ask for donations to cover our cost of this place, wherever two or more are gathered. There's expenses. Yes, we got that down now. We have a community mission. There are acts and heroes. You will be a force for good. We are independent. We don't accept sponsorship or promote outside businesses, organizations, or services. We are here to stay. With your involvement, the Sunday Assembly will make the world a better place. We won't tell you how to live, but we will try to help you do it as best you can. And our theme today is learning. I love learning new things, as evidenced by the chaos that is my craft room. I've got scrapbooking, I've got card making, I've got art journals and hand lettering. I went to find makeup sponges to put on my makeup. They're in the craft room because I use them for inks. I have cross-stitch and knitting. I've got piles and stacks of books, some of those which we are getting cleared out and getting rid of today. I started Duolingo for French and Spanish. I'm also using transparent language from the library. I decided to check out a ukulele from the library too in September because I can check out a ukulele from the library? This is hilarious! And then I missed it, so I borrowed one from Katie, and then I had to get one for Christmas along with all the books and videos and following people on YouTube, and yeah, it's still changing chords. It's fun. Other unsolicited plug for the library here. If you live in Davidson County, there is a section that says databases. Okay, there's going to be a couple. No, there's about 93. So besides the transparent language, there's lynda.com. You can learn different things for your business, your job. There's, of course, things for like Hoopla that you can get audiobooks, ebooks, movies. They also have the whole Great Courses series, which is a series on learning anything. Learning new skills, how to take care of yourself, how to cook, philosophy. So learning is everywhere. You don't stop learning once you leave school. And so today, our reader is going to be Georgia. She's reading The Reductive Sum of One, the Second Principle by Gary Zarda.
Yay. I want you to know I've been waiting to read this for 3 years, so here we go. I want everyone engaged in this. In my view, there are many rather than one. Try as the system might, they can't homogenize, can't standardize by test, terms, or convenient category what is essentially, pleasantly, more than one. See the one who's but a blurred tinkerer, the bodily kinesthetic, whose very name is a dance of the tongue. Her seat is a prison, neat rows the bars. She must move, act, dance, sign, more, more, more. Let her literally grasp a concept. See the one who's a veritable calculator, the logically mathed, for whom 2 + 2 is, of course, comfortably 4. His is the world of reason and reasons. He must equate, analogate, Pythagorate, promulgate the world's geometry. Let him cut clearly if his mind so dictates. See the world's sorter, as this one would see you. She's the visually spatial. For her, the layout of our spaces is a known frontier. Your chaos is her pattern. She must lay it all out. Paint, landscape, find Zen via Venn diagrams. Let her, by organizers, bottle Faulkner. See the one who takes things as personal, the ultra-intra guy of the inner mind, whose focus is a self-actualizing implosion, seeking solace within versus without. He must take pause, journal, meditate, make note of his mood's storms. Let him, above all, have a moment to think. See the one who's preferred you listen, the musical one with the headphones on. She's putting your lecture to ballpoint rhythms as others nearly come undone. She must swim sounds, tune timbre, make melody, be the critic analytic. Let her put wisdom to song. See the great communicator gathering the world to a position of one. He's interpersonal and tuned into you, people watching body language and motivations of the world's differentiated faces. He must reach out, take group temperature, mediate, subtly persuade. Let him work the crowd for good, or he might do it for evil. See the one who sees both the forest and the trees, the naturalist of flora and fauna. She is of and in the elements and finds peace in the transcendental hum. She must get her hands dirty, test soil, scope water, read the mysteries of the sky. Let her, nature willing, do more than discern non-living forms. See the one who puts the world to lettered form, the linguist, the crafter of language, who relishes zealously sounds and arrangements of words, is keeper of Cormier's favored embers, such as September, November, December. He must be given voice, read, write, speak the truly glorious word. Let him distill the vapors of thought. See by close attention the one of old soul, though young. She is spiritually intelligent, even though the intelligentsia banish her realm to mere superstition out of fear of the ungraspable abstract. She must make connections, seek justice, believe in unity, ultimately serve a higher cause. Let her, rather than answer, simply savor the moment's question. These are but a few of perhaps many, many more so-called multiple intelligences, but there is certainly more than one. One is but a number, misused in lumping singular individuals into a reductive sum of one.
Thank you for that, Georgia. So our speakers today are Catherine Aboud and Tin Nguyen from the Cutting Lab at Vanderbilt Education and Brain Research Laboratory. Tin Nguyen studied biochemistry and religious literature at Incarnate Word College and applied mathematics at University of Texas. His research includes brain structural and functional development, cognitive nature of reading and language-related processes, and psychometric and statistical modeling. Catherine Aboud received her BS in Mathematics and English from Virginia Tech and an MFA in Poetry at George Mason. Catherine is particularly interested in multiple types of neuroimaging approaches to examine the neural correlates of semantic processing and how deficits in these processes contribute to reading difficulties. In her spare time, she likes to read bad science fiction novels. She has told me there will be some audience participation today, and I told her we would not disappoint. Tin and Catherine.
Hello. This is a much cooler environment than I was expecting, so this is awesome. Thanks. So I'm gonna give kind of the first part of this, and then I'll hand it over to Tin. But I'm really happy to be chatting with you all today. I'm excited. I really enjoyed that reading just now. It was really cool, and I think I'm gonna try and weave it into this too. So in front of you, you have a quote from Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh. I will proclaim to the world the deeds of Gilgamesh. This was the man to whom all things were known. This was the king who knew the countries of the world. So I guess I'm going to start audience participation off right away, actually. I was going to wait until a little bit, but... So in order to read this and understand it and comprehend it, we have a complex number of things that are happening. And we can describe these in terms of the cognitive or skill-based things that we can do. Today we're going to be talking about what that cognition is and how that maps onto the brain, and a number of other things. So what are some things that just come to mind right now when you think about what you have to do in order to actually extract meaning and have it internally in your mind? Because it's living in you right now, right?
You have to know the language.
Yep, you have to know the language. And so what does it involve to know the language? What do you think? Yep. So I'm hearing transforming the written symbols into sounds, so knowing what the letters are. Exactly. What else?
Meanings of words.
Being able to see, yep. Yeah, starting with the most basic, yep. Being able to see, that's good. or doing Braille, yep. And I heard another? Meanings of words, good. I like this. We're starting at the very beginning. That's good. Okay. So we're going to build up from there. I'll actually, we don't want to get too many spoilers. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about how complex this actually is. And specifically, we're going to be talking about how the brain reads, why the brain struggles with reading. And I think once we understand how complex it is, it makes complete sense that people struggle with reading. And also then Tin will be talking about how reading environment impacts the brain, so kind of going the other way. And how many of you know someone that struggles with reading? Can you raise your hand? Or you yourself struggle with reading? I know I do. Yeah, so we know that 1/3 of fourth graders are performing at below basic reading levels. And this is one of the motivating factors for our lab studying reading and reading comprehension deficits. So this means that they're unable to actually extract meaningful information from a text. And there are a number of other kind of depressing statistics. So this is why we study reading in terms of the clinical sense. And also I enjoy studying language just because I think it's super cool. So we're going to start breaking this down like we just attempted to. But let's start with something more basic. So we're going to start with the word cat and build our way up from there. So we can see the word cat. As people mentioned, we have to be able to take those symbols and then map them onto sounds. And we do that for k, at, and then we have to integrate across that. So deficits in this are what happen in dyslexia. But once we're able to integrate those letters into the word cat, we then have a neighborhood of concepts that are associated with the word cat that inform our understanding, so that when we read that word, we know what it means and we know that it means a cat. I always try to put cat pictures and GIFs in my presentations if possible. I feel like, yeah, you can't go wrong with that. And so you can see that the weighting or the size of these relationships are different. So some are much more strongly related, and so we call this like semantic relatedness or semantic neighborhood, which just means that we have tight correspondence between the word cat and the word dog, for instance. So when you ask people what they think of with the word cat, then that's what they rate the highest. So when we're getting a sentence like the cat licked its paw, you're not just accessing the words in isolation, and then performing the sum of that access, but the words help support each other so that you can access them more easily. So when you have the cat licked its paw, paw is closely associated with cat, and so it's easier to access the word paw because you've gotten cat, if that makes sense, as you're progressing along the sentence. And is that all you need to understand a sentence? No. So, okay, and that allows you to, there you go, there's a GIF. I know some people say GIF, but I adamantly say GIF. Okay. Okay, good. So obviously we have the cat licked its bowl. Bowl is kind of associated with licked, maybe, but not really with cat. So we're getting kind of that we're not just having this sort of local access of words supporting each other, but when you get the unit the cat licked, then suddenly your probability of getting the word plate or bowl or something like that becomes higher. So you have this integration process that's happening across units of words. So it's not just individual words. So for instance, if I say plaid, but then I say plaid jacket, suddenly you're not just envisioning these two separate things, but you've united it into one thing of integration. And this involves higher level processes that also feed off of what we've experienced in the world. So that's how we develop the probability of what comes up later in the sentence. And that also lets us know when things aren't possible, like the cat licked the sky. So here the cat is confused. That's why I put the GIF there. Now, interestingly, if you have a story where there's a cat and the cat is going up in a hot air balloon and finds out that the sky is actually made of cheese, and then you say, and then the cat licked the sky, when you measure brain signals of someone compared to just getting the cat licked the sky, we're amazingly able to adapt this strange information into a context, and then it's no longer problematic. So we have this larger context as we get with the wider quote that we have that helps feed into the current sentence. So we see that we're getting these kind of layers of integration that are happening all the way from the bottom, from integrating sounds up to integrating concepts within the story that you're reading. So building back up to the skills that we need, we have sounding out and vocabulary, right, at the word level, and then the vocabulary kind of feeds across the sentence. using grammar and this integration of words? And then what other kinds of things are you thinking about now in terms of building meaning across a whole like passage or story? Yep.
Is your familiarity with the world, like, do you know what a king is? Do you know what countries are?
Yep, exactly. So world knowledge. Perfect. Context, yeah, so the local context around, so being able to remember what came prior, so having memory and having this kind of online working memory process. Personal experience, great, and that is different. So you have this kind of like general understanding of the world, and then you have your kind of autobiographical experience that you're integrating. Yep. And you also have, so you got almost all of them. And then you also have this kind of organizing information. So, and that becomes particularly important when you're, for instance, reading scientific texts and that kind of thing, where you're trying to basically place information and keep track of the order of events, or in a story too. So we have a lot going on. And these roughly fall into 3 categories. And this is kind of just we put them into these categories to help understand them, and they also fall into different parts of the brain. So we have sounding out, which is straightforward, and also for some reason at the very bottom of that circle. And we have the vocabulary, something called oral language, which is the vocabulary, grammar, and integrating words. So processes that we use when we're talking to each other, not just reading. And then you have this general type of processing that isn't specific to language. So we call those sounding out, oral language, and executive skills. So the executive skills are things that typically take place in the prefrontal cortex. So things like working memory. You don't just need that for reading, right? You need that for a lot of things. But it integrates with reading processes in order for you to access information in a text. So now I'm going to move into the brain section, and oftentimes I get the question, why study the brain? And my normal answer is actually the final one, which is because it's fun. I love the brain. I think it's fascinating. We all have one, hopefully, and we're all using it right now. But a couple other things that probably fly a little better when you're applying for grants. One is that you have prediction abilities. So sometimes you can have, for instance, 2 children with dyslexia. They both went through intervention. They look the same before the intervention, like their paper pencil tests aren't different, but one responds to intervention and one doesn't respond to intervention. And so in that case, our lab, for instance, has gone in, used MRI to study what's going on in the brain during reading before intervention, and could potentially predict who's going to respond and who's not. Now that's still pretty early, so what I described is the ideal. But obviously there's a lot of complication to that. But that's kind of something we can hope to do. And that goes into how behavior doesn't capture everything. And also potentially down the road doing brain interventions, non-invasively, obviously. So just, some of you might have heard of like TMS, where, you might be able to stimulate certain parts of the brain. But also because it's fun. So now we're going to get into what we actually do in the lab. So I made this. I'm very proud of it. We put kids in the scanner, and they go through a lot of training. We have several longitudinal studies, so a lot of the kids end up really enjoying it, and we have kind of like the awesome star team of scanners who have come back. I think one kid's come for like 11 times or something. And basically, when they go in the scanner, we're taking pictures of their brain, and we're doing 2 types of pictures. I'm going to be talking about what's called functional MRI, which is where every 2 seconds you're taking a low-resolution 3D picture of the brain. So you're like sampling what's going on as they're doing a task. And the other is you do a much slower collection of a 3D picture of the brain, and that's where you get this beautiful like structural information of like gray matter, white matter, and you can kind of compare brain structure. And Tim's going to get into that a little more. And this is what they see when they're in the scanner. So hydroponics is a fancy name for plants growing without soil. And then we also have to have comparison tasks, because you don't want to just look at everything that's going on when you're reading a passage. So you can compare it to just word reading, like words that are out of order but are matched, and also non-alphanumeric symbol processing. Are there any questions about anything so far? Feel free to shout anything out.
Quick
question.
Yep.
How does it work when, so I've seen, I've been in an MRI too. Where are they seeing those words? Are they projected or something? Or are they holding something?
It's projected, so basically the screen is behind them, and then it's reflected off of a mirror, so it's very comfortable. So they're just they're just laying down and watching that, and then they also get to watch WALL-E. So everyone in the lab has watched WALL-E about 1,000 times. But I noticed something different every time I watch it. It's made me really appreciate WALL-E. So yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Yep.
My son says, I can kind of get where he's coming from, but he says used instead of used.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, why can't I get him to say used?
Used instead of used.
Instead of used, yeah.
And is that when he's speaking, but also when he's reading?
In a sentence, he hates to read.
Mm-hmm.
So he's just saying, and I've taken him to speech therapy and all that good stuff, and I just want to know his thought pattern there. Why can't he get used in his head as opposed to
Used versus used. That's tricky, and it could be like a number of things. And you noticed it like before reading happened, like when he was just speaking.
Yeah, he's always
as well.
still says that, yeah.
Yeah, so it might be an articulation. So we'll be talking about kind of the different areas of the brain. So some are kind of like related to specifically to reading and mapping that onto sounds, but then that communicates with areas related to articulation. So, and that moves into speech, and when there are difficulties with speech, then, going to speech therapy. So, but I'm not sure exactly, but that's interesting. I would say listen to the speech therapist. They really know a lot. They know a lot more about the speech stuff than I do, but it's really interesting. Yeah. So here we have basically, this is the front of the brain, this is the back of the brain. So we're looking at the left side. I actually got a reviewer who made me put left on this in a paper once, but anyway. But so here what we're getting is basically this statistical summary across a number of subjects. So we've kind of collapsed time in each of the subjects, and then we've averaged across all the subjects to look at word reading versus that symbol baseline. So we're kind of cutting out the most basic visual processing and just looking at what's relevant in words. So we see that we have a lot of this left side. So I'm sure many of you have heard about how language is predominantly left, though we do see a lot of right hemisphere as well. And so this is roughly how these areas map onto these three skill sets that we talked about. We have executive skills that are predominantly, most of them are in the prefrontal cortex, like in terms of executive stuff, and we'll see in a second that we have higher level skills elsewhere too. But we have this temporal lobe here where vocabulary, it's commonly thought to support vocabulary. Can you still hear me when I sort of turn this way? Okay. And then you have this frontal area, which you have this interesting kind of gradation between, basically you have articulatory processes higher up, so that's where some things happen there. And then as you go down, you get more of this vocabulary center here, and you have some syntax later on that we'll talk about. But this is just word level so far. And then we have this really important area called the visual word form area, which is in between the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe. And at this junction, you have this area that seems to really like rapid processing of words. So when you all see the word cat, you don't have to sound it out anymore. You just know that it sounds like cat. So that like rapid processing is associated with the visual word form area. And all of these areas aren't just activated, so they're not just working harder during word reading, but they're also chatting with each other. So you have these, communication circuits between all these areas, and they seem to also sort of all communicate very closely with the visual word form area. And I think it's pretty interesting, because what we'll find is that it goes along sort of with the reading today, that the old method of looking at the brain was kind of like there's one function, we're trying to like basically create this complex brain map where this is what this one region does and this is what this one region does, kind of like a one-to-one, like what everything does. But what we're finding now is that all these areas are talking to each other, and so that every area has a complex function that's much more abstract than we think, so that each area is doing multiple things through its different communications with other brain areas. So it's not just one thing. So when we look at word reading problems, a lot of these areas pop up. And we see that the balance of skills that are dinged, the primarily sounding out is a big problem in the visual word form area, and then it trickles up into these kind of oral language skills. But interestingly, there we go. Interestingly, we have a study that shows that if you have more prefrontal activation, that the prefrontal parts of the prefrontal cortex that aren't shown here basically can help to remediate and interfere with like dysfunctional language network connectivity. So basically, if you have increased executive skills, like that planning and organizational ability and higher level stuff, sorry, one second, then if those are more active, then it can help sort of mediate deficits in that reading network. Yes.
One question I keep coming up with in my experience is early training in like phonics.
Mm-hmm.
Does that, in this case, affect the executive skills of helping sounding out in oral language?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's something called like the reading wars. I don't know if anyone's heard of that, but about like very different camps of like how reading should be taught in schools. And but it seems that for some readers, and I've talked with my boss Lori Cutting about this, some readers seem to be magical readers that whatever they're taught, they're going to learn how to read, right, regardless of what they're taught. But that for children who struggle with reading, it seems to be hugely helpful to be taught, to specifically be taught phonics, so to be taught how to sound things out. And so our interventional approaches always, work in this sound to letter mapping stuff. But there's a lot of debate, so I think that's all I'll say about it.
Then in Tennessee, you have the same people who make fun of you for saying demon brewing.
Oh, yeah.
You were saying
Yeah. There's definitely like dialectic differences too. I just think demon brune sounds better. Sounds a lot more intense, more epic for your commute to work. So then we'll move on to passage reading, and you can kind of see. So this one is still just versus that symbol baseline. So if we're comparing it to words, it would kind of subtract out a lot of these language areas. But there's a reason we don't want to do that, which I'll tell you in a second. But you can kind of see, if you remember back to the words, that we're getting a lot more extensive activation, right? Just more color on this brain, right? But you also see that there are a lot of overlapping areas. And so as you're reading passages like the Gilgamesh passage, you still have word reading processes that are happening in these areas, but then you're also getting things like the angular gyrus up here and more of the prefrontal cortex that are supporting this kind of integration of world knowledge. And so the angular gyrus is a super cool region. It's like an everything region. And a lot of these areas that are kind of in between different parts of cortex, like temporal lobe versus occipital, they do these kind of integration processes. So the angular gyrus helps to build up units into this semantic, like coherent internal representation of the text, whereas the prefrontal areas are kind of keeping you on track, if that makes sense. And interestingly, the same areas that are active in word reading, they're not just doing word reading processes. So they're not just accessing vocabulary and et cetera. But when you're looking at passage reading, they're talking with that visual word form area, but they're also talking with the angular gyrus. So suddenly they're basically showing that they're multifunctional. They're doing these flexible connections. Yep.
Have you noticed that there's a difference in the length of the passage as far as how the brain responds?
Yes, there should be. It depends, I guess, on how in-depth. There are certain very consistent things where you're seeing, like for instance in stories, if you're just looking at stories, you're always going to see something called the default mode network, which involves this angular gyrus and prefrontal areas. And so regardless of length, you're going to get, it's kind of like a social processing network where it's integrating the social information of the passage and connecting these concepts into a whole. But I'm not sure whether, Tin, do you know whether a longer passage would? Oh, yeah. So you also you can have, if you have more central information that's really important to the passage, then you might have more central activation like within the brain in the midline and that kind of thing. And we do find that different types of, I didn't include it here, but if you have scientific text versus stories, you have really different activations in the brain, which is pretty exciting too. And I'll just finish up here and turn over to Tin. But comprehension problems, you can see, involve a much wider range of activations. It's not just kind of these local activation differences, including in the prefrontal cortex. And so our lab really studies how executive skills and oral language skills correspond with comprehension ability to try and get at why kids who don't have dyslexia still have trouble extracting meaningful information from a text. And there's the angular gyrus. So I guess my take-home points are that word and passage reading, they're complex processes that kind of build off of each other, and we have these multifunctional areas. And that word reading and passage reading have largely different brain patterns, whereas for a long time people just were focusing on dyslexia. We're now starting to also focus on these comprehension deficits. So with that, I guess I'll take any final questions and then I'll hand it over to Tin because I don't want to go too far over. Yep.
Other than the words, have you done like pictogram, hieroglyphic, emoji type?
Oh, that'd be cool.
Well, and also other languages.
Yeah. So our lab doesn't look at other languages. It would be really cool to look at emojis. That'd be awesome. Yeah, but I'm not super familiar with the multiple languages. I am starting to get into it because actually my husband is Syrian and we have a 2-month-old and we're starting to speak Arabic and English in the house. So I'm going to be moving into figuring that whole thing out. Yeah. Yeah. Any other?
How much of this is down just to physical size of certain parts of the brain? So if someone just happens to have a larger portion, would that be advantageous, or is it not size, is it quality?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we talk about kind of the structure of the brain, which Tin will be getting into, we're talking kind of about like the thickness of the cortex and surface area. So that's kind of getting at the size issue. And what you find is that there is decreased structure, for instance, in the visual word form area for children with dyslexia. And so, but you don't always have a correspondence between structure and function. So sometimes you'll show a functional deficit, but not a structural one. And so kind of the mapping isn't always clear. Yes?
What age of kids do you study?
It's a great question. So we study children from, I guess we're starting to get into younger, but right now most of our longitudinal studies are from second grade or first or second grade through 4th grade. And then we also have some adolescents, getting into later grades. And then when kids drop out at last minute and we still have to pay for the scan time, we scan adults. So, yeah.
I'm just wondering, my daughter has severe dyslexia. I've begged people to help her for many years, and it took till high school for anybody to even know what it was.
That's hard.
She's 16 now, and her comprehension is through the roof. She could tell me every word of every book she's ever read because she's had to read each sentence 4 times.
That's fantastic.
She knows all of it, but it takes her, 5 times as long
Yeah.
to read it.
Well, and it's a really important point because for a long time there's this huge misunderstanding of dyslexia, and people thought that it was an intellectual disability, and that's absolutely not true, right? And that's part of the interesting part about the executive functions being able to, that basically a lot of readers with dyslexia have this amazing capacity to overcome, to a certain extent, their difficulty with reading through strategizing, and then they end up being able to be very strong comprehenders, but it does take a lot more time. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Cool. Well, I'm going to hand it over to Tin, who's going to move on to how a reading environment impacts the brain.
Okay, so just a full disclaimer. Usually I get very anxious talking to a lot of people, so I usually ask the producer to turn off the light so I can pretend like I talk to myself. Plus I'm not as funny as Catherine, and my my slides is not as interactive as hers, but I'll try to get at some of it. So back to the dyslexia topic a little bit, that sometimes we call dyslexia as a learning disabilities, but then we can't quite encapsulate it as a disabilities because children with dyslexia has other phenomenal abilities as well, such as working memory. For instance, my friend right now, at my age, she is already a doctor just because she has amazing memories that she could memorize anything just once, seeing it. So that's the issues with things that we treat as learning disabilities, because nothing is black and white as we see. So for instance, one of the way that we observe that is how the environment shaped the brain. Now I'm moving from how the brain functions, as Catherine just described, to how the brain responds to the environment and how it is shaped correspondingly. So from Catherine's presentations, we have learned that there are certain skills that kids need to master and refine before they enter first, second, and third grade. And these skills are called the emergent literacy skills, for instance, vocabulary or phonics, such as they have to know how to segment words and letters in order to read the language. And these are very important skills. These are not reading skills yet, but these skills are expected to be mastered by first grade in order to advance more into what is called a fluent reading and reading comprehension. As you know, that reading comprehension is very important to even do math, because though lengthy math problems, we need to understand the questions and extract the information, important how to do the calculations. So, and Laurie Cutting, our professor, has kind of posited that executive function is kind of the skills of the frontal lobe that direct all of these throughout development, and how that kids use executive function to support their reading. For instance, dyslexia use working memory to direct their inability to read once and twice, but they can comprehend essentially everything. So we can ask the questions like, what factors actually drive the development, cognitive and academic development? So we know the two possibilities, the question debate between nature and nurture. So for natures, we have the genetic predisposition that we can't quite change. So I'm not too interested in that. I'm interested in the environment just because it's more malleable on how we can change it to help the children. So going back to the model, we know that one factor of the environment that has been very well studied is the social economic status. So there's a lot of hot topic on this because usually children come from high income families tend to have better performance in school, better IQ as opposed to their peers from poverty. Why? Because children from poverty tend to have less access to literacy related support, less access to tutorings and etc. But I argue that this is all wrong because this can't quite get into how we kind of saw the environment that surrounds the child himself or herself. So I argue that literacy environment is much a better proxy on how we can measure how the children would grow. So what can go into defining what constitutes literacy environment? So we know that two possible factors, which are home literacy environment and school literacy environment. And what goes into home literacy environment is how often and how frequently and the degree of complexity, the interaction between the parent and the child. And the conversational turns. So for instance, parents who are from poverty tend to have 2 or 3 jobs that occupy their time from spending with their children. So the children tend to be deprived of these conversations and the intellectual engagement with the parents. And some parents who have gone to college are more likely to know more SAT, ACT words than parents who haven't gone to college yet. So we'll see that the degree of complexity of the vocabulary that the parents introduce to the children. And just some parents have been suggested to read to the children, but that's not quite as interactive when they read with the children. They're in the process of more interactive reading with their children tend to enhance their cognitive development more. And at what age do the child was started learning to read? For instance, like at first or second month of being born, the children have been taught 2 or 3 languages already, which is quite phenomenal. And at school, school literacy environment, so the phonics instruction is now a much more robust method to teach, whereas opposed to older methods, which is the whole language, is where one word, one sound. So for instance, when I say the word dog and dog, you can see that you can hear that the both of the words sound the same, but when I spell dog, the first dot would be D-O-G, and the second dot would be D-A-W-G, and they look different, but they sound the same, for instance. And if the child needs extra tutoring at school, etc., and whether the kid receive group method of reading or individualizes at Montessori, where it's kind of catered toward how the kids' talents are unfolding. So there's many more factors that involve in literacy environment. So the take-home message is that literacy environment is more child-centric and diverse than using socioeconomic status to measure how the kids would develop. So what do socioeconomic impacts would look like in the children? So we have the household income is one of them, and the neighborhood that they live in, and also where the children go to school. So for instance, some schools are called the Title I school that receive additional funding towards supplementing the teacher's salary, and also additional resources for the kids to purchase up-to-date textbooks. So this create a high income and lower income bracket that also reflect on high achievement and low achievement respectively. And the first person that introduced the brain change, the brain mediation between the poverty and achievement is Kim Noble from Columbia University. She's suggesting that poverty influencing achievement gap by way of altering the brain structures. So when observed throughout the entire socioeconomic spectrum, we see that children from higher socioeconomic status tend to have higher plasticity and sensitivity within their brain that is more adaptive to changes of the environment. So what do we know so far? We know that the environment changed the development of the children by way of socioeconomic background and literacy environment. And the environment shaped cognition through the brain and by way of plasticity and sensitivity. And this is true for socioeconomic status. But what we don't know is how literacy environment can kind of mitigate this gap that is posed by socioeconomic status. So literacy environment from our lab has been proposed to be a protective factors against for children coming from poverty line, where it's kind of spanned across both home and school, where children who engage more actively in literacy environments, such as reading more actively with just adults, if they receive more support from their peers and adults, they also tend to perform much better. But we don't know how the brain observe in this case, as I had mentioned, and especially if the brain structure has been dictated on how they turn out by social economic status already. So I want to press the point that literacy environment do not conform to how social economic gradient looks like. So we have low income and high income, and so we would see that high income family would have high literacy environment. That's not true, because sometimes if you're born rich, you might be lazy. But some parents are very supportive of their children's growth and future and outcomes, so they engage more actively on reading with the children, support them in many ways they want. So there's perhaps a compensation effects within low income families as they engage more actively in positive literacy environment. So as we observe that right here we have 500 brains of children from age 6 to 14 from our lab. And we see that literacy environment shapes the brain regardless of where you're coming from, and especially at later ages. So the first circle right here is when they start going to school, so pre-school ages, so that first grade and second grade. So we see that there's no effects of literacy environment just because socioeconomic status kind of dictates this brain shaping. But as the children grow more into adolescence, when they enter high school, we start to see that there's much more robust change and response to literacy environment. And these children tend to perform in par with their peers from high-income families. And this aligns with the fact that the changes is directed by also executive functions and brain and reading region of the brain that develop along the line with the brain trajectory as well. So in summary, that literacy environment can change and respond to age on how the children respond to school materials. And it's also nested within the effects of whether you're coming from high or low income family. And it's not shown here is that in early ages, children who are engaging in positive and actively in literacy environment, yet coming from poverty, tend to have much more robust changes in their brains as compared to their peers. So I want to take the final message is that literacy environment overrides the effects of poverty, etc. So I'm gonna take some questions. Yes.
Being a little older, I watched different ways of taking in information. Used to be pretty much all reading, then we started getting into audio, now we're into video.
Right.
Does the format of input make major changes?
That is a great question because not all families will have computer systems. So it's just, I would assume it's just like the degree of exposure to conversation, or it's just like more interactively engagement with something more lively than just passively staring at things, if that makes sense. For instance, like some parents can just talk at their children and the children don't really engage in the conversation and just passively listens. It does not really engage in, it doesn't stimulate them intellectually in order to kind of guide, just there's more robust development in that way, if that makes sense.
So what you're saying is TV as a babysitter is not the best option?
Well, it can, because there's some educational shows such as Sesame Street, which doesn't really, not there anymore. But I mean, it's great, I suppose. I mean, that's just a great question, just because there's so many factors go into deciding how the child turns out and whatnot. Yes.
I have a question, if we could rewind back to reading and then how that affects brain development. We have an ongoing discussion in our home whether our child should do his reading on his Kindle or on paper books. And I try to encourage him to take in from both mediums because I feel like those skills are so necessary in our world. But is there a benefit to reading like electronic media versus paper media? What's the comparison with that?
So that is a great question because everyone has always argued that book reading is much better. But it seems that we haven't found any concrete evidence arguing for or against that. I don't know. Do you know anything about that?
I know it's a hot topic, but I'm not familiar with research. I think it's probably like up and coming.
She's all like, I'm so glad she didn't ask me.
Well, I can't argue with you that right now we're looking at the screen, so that's more electronics, whereas we're old school. I mean, I like to read books where I can feel more tactile feelings and then the smell of books. But I guess that varies from person to person as long as they're engaging into the text.
Right. Well, like book romance aside, where we like touching paper and it smells nice and everything, is there any actual, have you seen any benefit to reading paper media versus electronic media?
That I'm not sure. Just, I mean, that I can argue along the line that when you are engaging conversation, you're not really seeing things, but you are mentally picturing words as you are engaging conversation. So I guess like there are different outlets where you can be exposed to written text, speech, and etc. Like just like different formats and forms of the written language and the spoken language. Yes.
I'm wondering if the socioeconomic factor has changed now for the kids that have more, library programs and stuff available, so it doesn't matter if you don't have a lot of money at home. You can still bring your kids to places. You can still they have access to things regardless of their the type of home environment now versus before. And I'm wondering if that is making the difference there.
Yes, I do agree with you on that because Kim Noble, who is from Columbia University, was being a little pessimistic when she say that if you're from poor family, you also have poor intelligence. The method effects and things and whatnot. But like I said, as you suggested, there is just much more programs where they can engage kids in low poverty that they can help them, assist them along the way in seeing these achievement gains. So yes, I do see that facts a lot. Yes. Sure. Yes.
I have one more question. Being in that environment, where does stuttering, I know when I was on the puberty side, but it was 5 of us, but I was the only one wanting to learn more. And it was that I had in my brain, I knew it was more input. So when we went to the doctor, or whenever was anything free, I took that. And typing it, because it was going so fast in my brain that I started stuttering. Because when I talked to Brian, he's had more phonics than I have. So when I see a word, it takes me longer to break down. But I was wondering, since I wanted to catch up, I learned to type, and I learned to read more. I listened to people to learn how to say things. And I think when you trying to digest all that knowledge, is that what's stuttering from? Because my brain was, I seen that word before. Like when you see social economics, I could see that, I see them together, but when I used to try to get them out to put them together, it came out in a stutter. So it made them think that my brain wasn't functioning fast, but really my sight went farther than my vocabulary could
Right.
get it out.
So, I mean, I do agree with you on that, just because I stutter as a kid as well, because overthinkers tend to think faster than they speak. So, yes, I mean, there's nothing wrong with us when we stutter. It's just we, I mean, we just
I'm
over.
already in socioeconomics because I heard you finish that sentence.
Right.
I wanted to understand the first 4 words. So
Right. So yes, we
came out.
overthinkers tend to think much faster than how we speak. So one component that in Catherine's presentation, that there is what is called the oral language, and there also the written language. So written language is what we adults see much more often than exposed to oral language. So, but those are 2 different components that we have to online stream and kind of parallelize them together. So what we think, you have to verbalize it, and sometimes it's the race between those 2 components cannot quite align yet, just because we think so much more than we can verbalize ourselves. So yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with us. Just because we stutter, we're just great thinkers.
All right, that was a lot of information, and so we're going to have our moment of reflection. We have our minute, and I had some images. See, going with the Kindle versus the books. We'll see if this goes automatically. There we go. Yay. I love serious baby. Okay, it is time for the band to come back up.
Tonality.
So the biggest thing often in learning is the question why. And if you've been around a child for any length of time, that is the most frequently asked question. Why, Mommy, why? And obviously, we tend to just say, because. Well, this may not exactly explain everything, but it gives you some things that you might be able to say.
Mic drop.
Because the world is round, it turns me on. Because the world is round. Because the wind is high, it blows my mind. Because the wind is love is old, love is new. Love is all, love is you. Because the sky is blue, it makes me cry. Because the sky is blue.
Joss's problem, as it's his time for trying my best. He will really enjoy this. He is going to be talking to us today about his role models. Yeah. Yes, we have a box.
What's in the box?
Not my head.
Well, this past December, I completed the coursework required for the Master of Arts in Teaching degree at Austin Peay State University. And I'm currently in the process of completing the final requirements for teacher certification. So when I was asked to present the Trying My Best today, with the theme being learning, I wasn't really surprised at all. But at the same time, I was kind of at a loss as to what to talk about. So I went to the Sunday Assembly Nashville YouTube channel. And watched past Trying My Best, and it occurred to me that I was looking at models to help guide me. So that led me to think about my role models growing up and how they influenced my childhood learning. So I'm going to focus on 4 of those today. 2 from my single-digit years in the 80s and my preteen and teen years in the 90s. So in my single-digit years in the 80s, one was He-Man, from He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. This is Prince Adam of Eternia and his pet tiger Cringer. So when Adam would hold up the Sword of Power and invoke the power of Grayskull, Adam and Cringer would become He-Man and Battle Cat. Now, Adam in the cartoon series, like, he was kind of portrayed as this character, really couldn't do a whole lot. He was kind of a weakling, so to speak. But when he became He-Man, He-Man could do anything. And so to, 5, 6-year-old Josh, that Josh identified so much with Adam because, he's 5 or 6 years old. He's seen the grown-ups do all these things that he can't do. And so he identified so much. So there's that role model to look after. That second role model is my dad, Bobby Brown.
Where's his doll?
He wasn't famous or well known. He was just my dad. And if you need any evidence of that, but he demonstrated doing his part for society by serving in the U.S. Army during the Korean War. And with just a 6th grade education and the skills that he learned in the service, he started at the bottom of our hometown's water department. And he worked his way up to become the department superintendent and served in that capacity until his retirement in 1987. 32 and a half years. He would pass 2 years later. I was 9 years old at the time, but in that time that I had with him, he demonstrated how a man should love a woman and how a man should love his son. Now, both He-Man and my dad were larger than life figures that influenced me, and I imagine most young children also had larger than life figures as their role models. Now, this influence usually continues into our preteen and teenage years, but more than likely, our focus and role models change. Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player of all time.
Amen.
Until LeBron James teams with the Looney Tunes. That's my opinion. But I loved basketball so much that I wanted to be in the NBA. When I wasn't flying through the Star Road in Super Mario World or doing my homework, I was outside shooting hoops. And I even tried out once for my high school team and I didn't make it. So that kind of forced me to reflect, see if that was really an option. So 14, 15-year-old Josh started making the comparisons between himself and Michael Jordan. And the more he made the comparison, there was one thing that was very different between him and Michael Jordan. One glaring factor that he couldn't ignore. And that's the fact that Josh was very, very whiny. Because he wasn't any good at basketball, and so he decided that probably a mental career was better suited. So at the time, teenage Josh was more proficient than most of his classmates at using computers. And I mean, I knew MS-DOS like the back of my hand. If something quit working, I could usually fix it. So I'm pretty much a computer ace, and it was anticipated at the time that computer-related careers was going to be the big money maker. So Bill Gates was a perfect role model for me. He knew his stuff like I thought I did. He was a total nerd like I was. and he was rich like I wanted to be.
I'm going to borrow from Diva. Well.
But in our preteen and teenage years, that's when we really start exploring what we want to do and be when we grow up. And our role models tend to reflect that. In my case, I started out wanting to be in the NBA. That changed to working in IT. I ended up doing neither one of those things. But other role models influenced me in other ways. Case in point, 3 of my role models that I didn't talk about were teachers. And it might be unclear which comes first, the goals or the role models, but in either case, these further influence our motivation and our goals and childhood learning, and they help us learn our personal moral code, and we adopt behaviors. And even those early role models can have influence in later years. For example, when I was a child, I looked at He-Man by himself and saw what he could do. But now when I look back, I see it was never just him. He had his friends, the heroic warriors, to help back him up. So when he needed help, people were there. And so that tells me that when I need help, I have backup. So our role models ultimately shape us as we grow and develop, but the lessons learned in our childhood stick with us for the rest of our lives.
So I want to thank everybody for coming to Assembly today. If this is your first time here, can you please raise your hand or even stand up so we can see you? Wow. Everybody give them a warm welcome. And there were 2 over here. Did you get those 2? No. Okay, there's 2 over here. All right, thank you so much. So we've got that. It's announcements and hat passing time. Like we said before, wherever 2 or more are gathered, there are expenses. So we'll be passing a hat. If you new people see that there's people not putting in, if we have a green name badge, we're supporting members, you can learn how to become one of those. Teresa should have a cell phone with a swiper if you don't have cash. If you prefer to pay by credit card, we can do that. As Don found out, there is Amazon Smile, so anything you purchase on Amazon, you get a kickback. He had a whopping 4 cents. But it adds up over time with everybody, as much as we all shop on Amazon. Okay. We've got some announcements. Lunch is served at Amerigo's. If you didn't RSVP, is there still room for them? Okay, we got that. The announcements will be in the insert in the program. I'll bring these up here. Special announcement on my smoop that I have. I do tea and books at the Cooks. It's because it's a 5th Sunday, so it's tea and books instead of beer and books. This month we're reading Out of My Mind by Sharon Draper. It's about a child who has cerebral palsy and can't communicate, so everybody doesn't think that she's smart, and she really is. And then she gets the technology to bring that out. I've got copies of the books from the Nashville Public Library has Book Club in a Bag. So if you take one of the books, I do need your name and an email address because I do need that back because I have to return it as a set. If you're not able to, if you pick it out and then you're not able to come to the Sunday meetup, then that way I can, we can get together and get that back. The next month's assembly is going to be May the 6th. It's the first Sunday of the month. I can have it back then, but that's like the absolute latest. Please do not give me fines by not returning my book back to me. So we've got that. Help off and clean up. Got that. So I hope today that you've learned something at this assembly. I chose the quote on the front just because I found it and I laughed because there are so many quotes on learning. One of the first I was going to go with was, live as if you were to die tomorrow, learn as you were to live forever. We here know that we have one life and we try to make the most of it. So learning everything that we can in the time that we have. And from Josh's doing his trying my best, learning from each other, mentoring each other, and be there to help one of each other in that backup plan. And a small thank you to all of the people that have been helping me these past few weeks. You know who you are, and thank you.
One more quick announcement while the band is getting up there. Board elections are at the next assembly, which is May 6th. First Sunday, not the second Sunday, because we're trying to avoid Mother's Day. All right, so if anyone is interested in running for board, please contact me. You can contact me through Meetup. You can contact me through my email, brendaquinn@hotmail.com. But we would love to have you. It's just 4 meetings a year, so it is not a terrible burden. And we have 4 open positions. We have 2 incumbents running, but we also need fresh blood, fresh meat, whatever we want to call it. So we've got 2 open positions. So we really hope that you will run. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Brenda. And let's give a warm welcome or warm thank you to Melissa Cook for hosting us today. We have 2 songs to close you out, and I told you that we're going to get you all moving. So this is the part where I'd ask you to kind of stand up and maybe stretch a little bit, and we're going to do another couple learning songs here. You ready, Sebi?
I don't know.
I think Sebi's ready, and if Sebi's ready, we're all ready. Steven ready?
I'm not ready.
All right, y'all ready? Feel free to clap along, sing along, dance along. Here we go.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Things you never knew before. Same thing like I-4-E, steps down the sea. 1, 2 + 2 makes 4. Now, I'm gonna teach you all about love, girl. 6 step down, take a seat. All you gotta do is repeat after me. ABC, it's easy as 1, 2, 3. As simple as do, re, mi. ABC, 1, 2, 3, baby, you and me, girl. ABC, it's easy as 1, 2, 3. As simple as do, re, mi. ABC, 1, 2, 3, baby, you and me, girl. I want to love it just a little bit. I'm gonna teach you how to sing it out. Come on, come on, come on, let me show you what it's all about. Even if it's Christmas, all the branches of the learning tree. But listen, without the roots of love every day, girl, your education ain't complete. Teach gonna show you how to get it in. Spell me, you, it makes 2. Listen to me, baby, that's all you gotta do. ABC, it's easy as 1, 2, 3. As simple as do, re, mi. ABC, 1, 2, 3, baby, you and me, girl. ABC, 1, 2, 3. Sing a simple melody. ABC, that's how easy love can be. That's how easy love can be. Sing how easy love can be. 1, 2, 3, baby, you and me. I think I love you. No, sit down, girl. Get up. Come on. Show me what you're working with. Shake it, baby. Shake it, baby. Uh-oh. Shake it, baby. 1, 2, 3, baby. ABC, baby. Do, re, mi, baby. That's how easy love can be. ABC, it's easy as 1, 2, 3. As simple as do, re, mi. ABC, 1, 2, 3, baby, you and me. I'm gonna teach you how to sing it out. Show you what it's all about. ABC, it's easy as 1, 2, 3. As simple as do, re,
Y'all be.
All right, so the unnamed assembly band is up here, as in every other month that we do this. All the way to my right, which is your left, we've got Steve Hughes on the keys. We got Taylor Pope on bass. Deb Dennison singing. We have Chris Shannon on the drums. We've got Lindy on acoustic guitar. We've got Steven on the electric guitar. We've got Adam, who is here and will be back, we hope. He's much quieter this way, isn't he? And my name is
those
Debbie.
sound technicians back there?
Oh, yes, let's not forget we've got Jason and Jordan and Patrick and Jeremy and Zoe.
Those
Zoe's
knobs
down
don't
here.
turn themselves, do
No.
they?
No.
What is he doing?
Oh, look out.
You all ready? All right, let's do it. Well, we got no choice. All you girls and boys making all that noise. 'Cause we found new joy. Well, we can't salute you, can't find a plan. If that won't suit you, that's a drag. School's out forever. School's out forever. School's out for recess. No more pencils, no more books, no more teachers, dirty looks. Take it, Steven! Well, we got no plan, and we got no principles, and we got no innocence, and we can't even think of a word that rhymes. School's out for summer. School's out forever. School's out for recess. No more pencils, no more clothes, no more teachers, dirty looks. Out for summer, out for fall. Are you ready? School's out forever. School's out with fever. School's out with fever. School's out Y'all are awesome. Please all come to lunch. We'll see you next month.